Now all these mortise and tenons are going to be drawboard, and when you're laying out your draw borings, you want to leave them enough material, you know, kind of just equally space them around so there's enough material in your tenon and enough material along your mortise so that they don't crack or whatever. So what I did to lay these out is I'm just going to come over 1.25 inches from the edge of the mortise. That's going to leave enough meat on the tenon when I drill a hole through it that I don't have to worry about it cracking or anything like that. Then I'm going to transfer that line around to the front here. And then I'm going to come down 1 inch on the face of the top here. So come down 1 inch, kind of make a mark. And then that's where I will, with my awl, push in with my awl to give myself a nice area for my brad point drill bit to grab and drill through. Now on the, so that's how I'm laying out the draw boring on the legs. I'm going to do a little bit different on the stretcher since they're a little bit narrower of a tenon. I'm actually going to go 1 inch instead of 1.25 inches. I'm going to come 1 inch from each side and still 1 inch down. Okay, for the draw boring on the legs, for the stretchers, I'm going to just kind of find the edge of the tenons or the mortise opening here, make a little mark. Then I'm going to come over 1 inch, and if you had a rule, just use a rule instead of this way. I'm going to come over 1 inch from each side, and these don't have to be precise by any means. Then I'm going to draw a making mark at 1 inch from each of those marks, 1 inch down, and that's where I'm going to drill my draw bores for there. So now I have 1 inch of material on the tenon. These tenons go in, what, like 2.5 inches, so there's plenty of material below the tenon because you want to kind of like space these out so that they have the most strength. So this is a great location. It doesn't have to be exactly 1 inch, you know, it can be off a little bit. Doesn't really matter that much, but you definitely don't want them right along the edge here or too far towards the bottom or too far towards the top because there's going to be a lot of pressure. So if you have that draw bore way up here, there's not much material here at the top, you'll probably break out the top while it's trying to pull that tenon close. So you want to give yourself about, you know, just find a happy medium there. And so I'm just going to go, for simplicity's sake, 1 inch from the edge and 1 inch from the down from that face. So I start with a brad point bit and I'm drilling down about 4 inches because you want to go through the actual mortise and far enough into the far wall so that your dowel that you pound through has something nice to grab onto. So for the top it's going to be about 4 inches. For the legs it's going to be about 3.5 since they're not as wide. So I'm going to use 1/2 inch dowels for these drawboard mortise and tenons, and I get these from Lowe's. And when you're picking out the dowels, you got to look at them really close to make sure the grain is running parallel with the dowel, nice and straight. If it's running off from one edge to the other when you're pounding it in, it's probably going to break off. Then I just use a large pencil sharpener. That's the best way that I found to chamfer the edges of those dowels and give you a nice rounded area so that they can slope in and ramp off the offset holes that you're about to create. So then you'll pound all your joints together. It's a good time to test fit and make sure everything's fitting nice and snug and not too tight, not too loose. Hopefully it's not too loose because then that's hard to fix. Then you drop your brad point bit in, the same one that you used to cut, and I spin it backwards. That way it won't kind of grip the sidewalls going in the forward cutting motion. And I spin them backwards a little bit rather than hitting it with a mallet because that'll leave a really nice small divot on the face of that tenon. If you actually take a mallet and tap the drill bit too hard, you might end up making too big of a divot, and then it makes it hard to get your awl in there and move that divot the 1/16 of an inch that you want. If you make the divot too big, it might be more like 1/8 of an inch, and then you might struggle to get that dowel to make it through those offset holes. So I like doing around a 1/16 of an inch, especially on hardwoods like this. Anything bigger and you might run into some trouble. So then what you do is you take your awl and you position it about a 1/16 of an inch closer to the shoulder of the tenon. You definitely don't want to go towards the end of the tenon, because then you'll in fact push the joint apart. So you want to move it closer to the tenon and then tap it there.
Yeah.
Once all my drawbore holes are drilled properly, I can assemble this. Now I'm going to assemble each short side of the base first, and I add glue to the mortise, all 4 walls of the mortise, and all 4 faces of the tenon. Some people just do it on one or the other, but I like adding glue to all those surfaces, just that much better. So I'll insert the tenons into the mortises, tap both of them together, and this is where making sure that you have everything marked so you know which stretcher tenon goes into which leg mortise. And then you just take your dowels and pound them home, and they'll actually pull that joint really nice and tight together. So you don't need clamps or anything like that. As soon as you pound those dowels in, then the joint is strong. Again, anytime you do a glue up, make sure you do a practice run, have everything out where it needs to be, because you only have a certain amount of time for when the glue's up. That's one of the nice things about drawboarding, is you actually have to test fit everything first to make sure that it's going to fit properly, so you don't run into any snags. And I use a rubber mallet to pound it's kind of a hard plastic mallet to pound the dowels in there. If you use metal, you might end up splintering them and breaking them. So just be careful, it's a lot of pressure. Take your time, don't hit them too hard, and you'll be all right. At this point, I'll take a Japanese saw and I'll cut these dowels off. Now you can wait till the bench is fully assembled if you want, but it was a little bit easier to do it at this point, so I did it here. And you don't necessarily need this piece of paper. If you're careful, the set on the teeth on those Japanese saws are pretty much non-existent, so as long as you're careful, you won't scratch up the surface of the wood. I do it all the time without using a piece of paper. I don't really know what I did at that time. So in order to glue up the rest of the base, I'm going to add both long stretchers to one end of the base at a time. I'll glue up the mortises, put glue on the tenons, slide those in, add the drawboring pegs, then I'll add glue to the other side, and then assemble the other side and add the drawbore pegs on the other side. I think that's definitely the safest and easiest way to do it. Another drawboring tip is that you can take a round rasp and kind of slope the hole on the tenon. That way, as the peg comes through, it will hit that slope instead of the flat wall there. So you have the pegs which are sharpened and this slope, and that really will help that drawboring go together easy. Now at the last minute, I decided to paint the base on this. I know a lot of people freak out when you paint a nice hardwood, but I've seen some benches out there, some traditional like the shaker bench that has a painted base and it looks beautiful, so I thought it worked really well here. So I went with it and I'm really happy that I did. So if you don't want to paint the base, by all means, you don't have to. Just do whatever you'd like on that. So here I'm adding some runners that are 1 inch below the surface of the stretchers because I bought some 1x6 pieces of pine that I'll cut about, I can't remember what the dimension is, 22 inches. They'll be slats across there. On my previous bench, I used just a single sheet of plywood, and either method is just fine. Now here I'm adding the runner that the sliding Deadman is going to go on, and I made this in 2 pieces, a long piece and then a shorter piece towards the right hand side over there. That shorter piece is so that you can remove that runner to insert the sliding Deadman. That's one of the improvements that if you watch the intro you see, and it works really well. I think it's a great improvement that I'm happy that I did. Now I make this runner slightly taller than 1/2 inch and slightly narrower than 3/4 of an inch so that it fits in the groove on the bottom of that sliding Deadman and will actually slide and not bind up.
Cool.
So here you can see that I have the vise mounted to the bottom of the bench over there, and we're flipping it over and we're going to get it in position, then get everything on the base glued up, get everything around and ready to move the bench top over onto the base, which is the scariest part because this is probably 350-pound top. So once you get it moved, you got to be really careful and make sure you get everything in place. So now that everything's glued up, we move it into place and start pounding the tenons home. The best way to get these tenons to seat in the mortises is after you get them started with a mallet, then you actually can just lift up one side of the bench and then just drop it, and you let the weight of the bench drive the tenons home. It's really hard to do a dry run on this because the bench top is so freaking heavy that once you get this thing assembled, you're probably not going to be able to get it back apart to add your glue. So you just have to really be careful with your measurements. Once you have the base assembled, go around, measure, make sure everything's still going to line up, and then you just have some faith and you drive it home. Make sure you're going back and forth so that the bench top seats uniformly. You don't want one side to seat all the way down and the other side still out. It'll kind of jam in place and you could have some problems. So just go back and forth until it seats completely. Then I just go around again with the Japanese saw and cut all the dowels off. Now if you see, I'm holding the blade towards the middle, putting pressure on the middle of the blade. If you put your fingers and pressure towards the teeth, then your teeth of your blade will actually dig in. So if you kind of put pressure towards the middle of the saw, you won't score or mar up the wood at all.
So satisfying.
I actually do this part earlier in the build, but I'm showing you right now. I rip this board down to the maximum width I can get. If you're using hardwood, you might get a board that's 12 inches wide or 11 inches wide. You can choose to rip it as wide as you want, or you can actually make it narrower. So I go as wide as I want. I got, I think, a full 12 inches out of it, and that's the dimensions, that's the width that I cut the half lap on the legs earlier, based off of how thick I got that board. Then I place that board in place. It kind of will rest on the half lap joint of the legs, and I take a pencil and I draw the other side of that half lap joint. Then I'll use my router and I clamp a straight edge guide to it and route out the other half of that half lap joint on the back side of the apron. Then I'll lay out and drill all the holes that are in the apron using my drill press. Now you could also mount the apron to the bench and then use a hand drill and drill that out too separately, but I had someone who could help me hold this apron up, and I get a cleaner hole because there was a board backing the other side of that hole, so I didn't get any tear out. On this bench I decided to drill and screw the apron through the front to the legs. On my last bench, I just used shoring blocks from the back side, but this one I actually screwed it right to it. Either way doesn't really matter or make much difference. Then I also add some dog holes a little bit higher into the thickness of the top, because on my last bench I've had occasions where I've had narrower boards and I've wished I had dog holes where I could hold the board a little bit higher. Now to make the crochet, I took 2 scrap pieces and laminated them together, and then created my shape, which is basically about a foot long, that has a 3-inch opening on one side that tapers down, leaving me about 4 inches at the rear that I'll have something to screw through to the bench. And then I just cut that shape out on the bandsaw. That shape's in the plans, and you shouldn't have any problem coming up with something similar. Now that the bench is assembled, I'll do the final flattening, and I just go back and forth on both sides diagonally with a number 6, and I sharpen it several times so that I get nice clean cuts, because I don't want any tear out during this part of the flattening process. Again, you can use a router slit if you wanted to do that, but I find a hand plane, if you took your time and glued it up properly, really didn't take a whole lot of extra work. There are plenty of other videos out there on how to flatten a workbench or flatten large pieces, so I'll let you look those up and kind of figure out how to do that. Basically, you just go back and forth and long ways, and then vertically you check it with a square, you check it with a straight edge, looking for high spots, and just kind of go through that process. Now I'll just finish up my vices. I'm going to screw in my twin screw and mount that. Again, most of that information is going to be on the materials and the instructions that you get with this vise, so I don't need to go into a ton of detail here. There's actually several videos on YouTube as well of people installing these vices, so if you run into any troubles or beforehand, make sure you look those up and watch those. There's some really good info. So this time around, I actually bought this Miles Craft drilling guide. It was only like $30 on Amazon, and it works okay. I mounted a 3/4 inch Forstner bit in it, and allowed me to get a halfway straight line, halfway decent hole, about 1/2 inch down. That's about as far as I could go. Then I switched over and used a regular 3/4 inch drill bit, and was able to get the hole the rest of the way, since it was already started with that nice Forstner bit. Next, I start working on the sliding Deadman, and for this cut I just raise my table saw blade up and take several passes to remove most of that material. And now, since I installed the vise on the new bench, I can actually use the end vise features, clamp the board together, and use a chisel and a shoulder plane to flatten out that joint that's going to be the tongue that will ride in the groove on the bottom of the bench. Then I take the sliding Deadman over to my router table with a 3/4 inch bit to make the groove for the bottom. And then I just lay out and drill all the holes. Now you can leave the sliding Deadman rectangular like this, or you can take it over to a bandsaw and cut out a nice shape. I thought it was a really nice little extra touch to do, and it didn't take much time, so I cut out a nice shape on this one, but you could definitely just leave it rectangular if you want. Then I take a rasp and I kind of just chamfer all the edges. It's actually really easy with the rasp, and pretty much done, ready to install it. Then I went over all the raw wood and rubbed in some boiled linseed oil. Boiled linseed oil is a nice little protectant, kind of gives it a little bit of a finish, and you can always apply more later on. Gave it a really nice look, and I'm really happy with the bench. I hope it works out for you guys. Like I said, if you have any questions, give me a call and we'll get through this thing together. Thanks so much.